Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Victoria.
I start at the outset, Madam Speaker, by indicating that I will be sharing my time with my honourable colleague, the member for Desnay, Mrs. Nippy and Churchill River. Madam Speaker, this is an historic debate after an historic debate 5 days ago in this place, where my colleague from Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik Ayu, who had devoted 34 years of his life, had this House vote in favour not only of an aspirational document, but a document that would now guide Parliament in its relationship with First Nations peoples in this land. A bill that committed Canada to support, not just in words, but in action, something that has come to be known as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 32, sub 2 of which guarantees, and I quote, free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, close quote. Now, the honourable member for Lakeland seems to believe, as the Liberals across the way, that that means we can choose our friends. We can say, if you're with us, then that's okay, we got your consent. But if you happen to be a coastal First Nation, well, that's different, because you disagree with us. That is not how constitutionally protected rights and Aboriginal title works in this country, Madam Speaker, and that certainly isn't what I voted for when I stood proudly with my Liberal colleagues to vote for the implementation in our country of this historic United Nations document, guaranteeing the rights of our Indigenous peoples. And, Madam Speaker, I have to say I come with recent information from my riding. The member for Lakeland told us what her constituents think. Well, I have now information very clearly about what the constituents of Victoria, a community surrounded on 3 sides by oceans, think. Because, Madam Speaker, I organized on Friday, a couple of days ago, a town hall meeting on this project, the bailout by our Prime Minister of a leaky 65-year-old pipeline and the ability to create another pipeline, 1,000 new kilometers of pipeline, and a tanker project that would effectively almost triple the amount of diluted bitumen going by our waters in Victoria. You know, Madam Speaker, I thought I would just put a notice out on social media saying, would you like to come to a town hall on Friday? I did that on Tuesday. And I initially got we thought 200 people. Well, we got that in a couple of hours. And then we got up to 600 people. We had to change the venue twice, and we ended up with, I think, the largest auditorium aside from our hockey rink, where people told us what they thought. Now, Madam Speaker, this was not a rally. It wasn't intended to be a rally. Indeed, I invited a former Deputy Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs from the Government of Canada, Mr. Harry Swain, to speak about it from the business perspective, from the way in which Crown corporations are established, to give us a broader understanding of just what it means for the government to take over this project, somewhat in desperation, I might add, Madam Speaker. And it became very, very clear, despite our efforts to hear both sides, that the people of my community, including many, many Indigenous leaders around the coastal part of British Columbia, are deeply, deeply opposed to the risk that this government is prepared to impose upon them, without what Article 32 requires the government to do, namely take into account their perspectives. Now, Madam Speaker, I understand that the government wishes to create a Crown corporation. At least that's what the media informs us. I don't know whether that's how they're going to proceed. I'd like to back up. We have a court case in the Federal Court of Appeal which was argued several months ago, and which we expected to have a judgment from the court in the last little while, and I expect we'll get it soon. The temerity of the Liberals to proceed in this way before we have the decision of the Federal Court of Appeal is deeply disrespectful, and appears to me, Madam Speaker, to be a little inconsistent with their commitment to the rule of law, of which we heard so much this morning. Imagine The Federal Court of Appeals sat day after day after day and heard testimony about whether there was an infringement of Aboriginal rights in the process that led to the approval by the National Energy Board of this project. And then guess what, Madam Speaker? The government announces they're going to buy the whole thing and the right to triple the capacity and double the pipeline. Madam Speaker, does that sound like a commitment to rule of law and respect for Indigenous rights to you? And I had Indigenous leaders stand up at my town hall and describe their sense of utter betrayal and disappointment in this government. Because, Madam Speaker, you may have heard in your riding what I heard over and over in mine during the last election. There's no relationship more important to this government than that with Canada's First Peoples. I guess that was then and this is now. The sense of betrayal among First Nations is palpable, but, Madam Speaker, I come with real sadness today because what really disturbed me at this town hall, which had many people from all ages and all walks of life, was the sense of betrayal that young people felt in this government. And I am doing my best to tell them not to give up hope. First of all, they were told that the election, which led to 39% of the people getting 100% of the power, 39% of those voting for this government, about the same as, by the way, happened when the Harper government was elected, ended up with 100% of the power. And of course, you must have heard in your writing what I heard how many times in mine, that that would be the last election that would be first past the post. Our Prime Minister put his hand in his heart and said that. And now, Madam Speaker, they come to this town hall to be told that the government has decided not to stand up about climate change and be the climate leader that we heard our Prime Minister so proudly declare in Paris, but to actually become essentially the CEO of a pipeline. I don't recall seeing that in the mandate of any minister, let alone the Prime Minister. I don't recall reading that was going to happen, but I guess that's different now. So the point is, Madam Speaker, it's that sense of betrayal that young people feel, that sense of hopelessness, the existential concern about climate change, which I'm sure everyone in this House has had a conversation with a young person about. And now the government is doubling down, essentially, on subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Now, you may remember, Madam Speaker, at the G7 meeting about 2 years ago this month in Japan, our Prime Minister and other leaders said that they would terminate most fossil fuel subsidies. Canada and other G7 nations encouraged countries to join them in eliminating what they referred to as, quote, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And given, the declaration said, given the fact that energy production and use account for around 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, we recognize the crucial role that the energy sector has to play in combating climate change, close quote. It's going to be interesting to see what happens at the G7 meeting coming up when Canada has to explain why it's decided to double down on fossil fuel subsidies and become the champion of a pipeline. That is a little hard for young people, in my riding at least, Madam Speaker, to understand. Now, in terms of First Nations, what happens if a Crown Corporation is established? That's not a proponent like Kinder Morgan. That becomes the Government of Canada, doesn't it? Or is the government going to say, well, that's a Crown Corporation, that's arm's length? How many times have you heard the government stand up and say, we can't do anything about this telecommunications issue or this postal issue because that's a Crown Corporation, we don't really go there? Well, Madam Speaker, I wonder if it's going to be just the same from now on, because isn't the Government of Canada going to be the primary owner of that pipeline? And it seems to me there's an argument, at least, that they have responsibilities now that are enhanced vis-a-vis the consultation duty. And Madam Speaker, it was revealed by an access to information request that just before the pipeline was actually approved by the Cabinet, it appears that a decision had already been made by the government to full steam ahead, and so the consultation that occurred thereafter was nothing but window dressing. At least that's how it appeared objectively looking back at what happened. So, Madam Speaker, the level of commitment to First Nations, despite the heroic stance of the government in approving the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, I think, has to be suspect. Will they say that it applies in the past? Possibly not. But its spirit should guide this Crown Corporation's relationship with coastal First Nations people, and they do not approve, Madam Speaker. They are deeply, deeply opposed to this, and as I said, their sense of betrayal is obvious. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
I listened with great interest to my colleague across the way and heard him talk about his party's commitment to Indigenous people. And I thought we shared that, but I then went back and reviewed the NDP platform from the last campaign. On the Human Rights Tribunal ruling, where Canada was shown to be in short of providing the adequate supply for children's services, the party opposite's commitment in the last campaign, after talking about how important this case was to commit no dollars to resolving it. In fact, there's not one penny committed to health care, for Indigenous health care, in their platform. But what I find really interesting was the commitment around Indigenous infrastructure. $25 million will be spent in the fourth year of a mandate by the party opposite. $25 million does not even build a single water plant. Under that party, the boil water alerts would have doubled every year as a result of their underfunding. The member opposite speaks as if he cares about Indigenous rights. Why did he run for a party that put no dollars into Indigenous infrastructure, no dollars into Indigenous health care, and no dollars to actually transform the relationship that he says his party cares about?
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Well, I appreciate the lecture from my colleague across the way, Madam Speaker. I do remember that platform, and I remember the Liberals' platform as well. Two things of which stood out for me, as I indicated in my remarks. The first being that this would be the last election first past the post, and the second one was that suddenly the First Nations was the most important relationship amongst Canadians. Now, Madam Speaker, I don't know about you, but
Order. I just want to remind parliamentary secretaries that they should be even more so respectful of the rules of order within the House and allow the member to speak. And if they have other questions, they can stand up to ask. The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member referred to boil water advisories. I understand that the shortfall for clean water on First Nations reserves is $3.2 billion. The cost of just buying this leaky 65-year-old pipeline was $4.5 billion. So I don't think we need a lecture on skewed priorities from the member, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his heartfelt speech. Certainly, I agree with him when he says that this government is all talk and no action. $8.4 billion they committed to eliminate boiled water advisories on reserve, and we have more now than when we started. And so this is a total shame. And in terms of their priorities in the government, for the low price of $10 million, they could have had 3,000 well-paying jobs and fixed the rural internet hole and opened the border at Sombra in Sarnia-Lambton. And so I wonder if the member could elaborate on his feelings about the government's priority with respect to the First Nations people.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate your reference to boil water advisories. And the other things that the government said that they bought here was 15,000 jobs, which, of course, I heard the Minister of Finance say, and I gasped. Robin Allen, who's done a thorough analysis, former CEO of ICBC and economist for Credit Union Central, said that there's no number even approaching that there was something that spitballed by the Bank of Nova Scotia that suddenly became the holy grail for this government. I think it means 90 jobs in my province going forward after the construction. So in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, I really don't get it. But, Madam Speaker, there's also another kind of analysis, and that's the risk-benefit analysis. Even though I would concede that the risk of a catastrophic spill is small, the consequences of a catastrophic spill are enormous. And I was asked at the town hall, and I promised to ask the Prime Minister this question, and I'll do it now. In what way does this project help Canada transition to a low-carbon economy?
We have time for a very brief question. The Honourable Member for Saskatoon-Grasswood.
Madam Speaker, kind of different speeches from Lakeland to Victoria, but 43 First Nations signed on to Kinder Morgan, which would have given them $400 million. I'm wondering for the member from Victoria could comment on the graduation rates on reserves right now. 44% of First Nations between the ages of 18 to 24 living on reserves have completed high school. So I'm just wondering if that $400 million would in fact help those in need of actually graduating from high school.
A very brief answer from the member for Victoria.
Thank my friend for the colleague. You're right, it's very much different in Lakeland and in Victoria. I concede that. I have a hard time understanding what the graduation rates and reserves might mean. It might mean that the government could choose to put money into that, but of course the government has the ability to choose to put money anywhere that it wishes. We don't know.